Hey everyone, welcome in. We're going to go live here in about 60 seconds. Just want to give everybody a chance to file in. Super excited about today's conversation with Jules. And so I'm going to put the countdown on and we'll be back in about 60 seconds. So hang tight. See you soon. Awesome. Jules, how are you?
Hi, great to be here. Thank you for inviting
Awesome.
me.
Yeah, well, welcome everyone to the Hired Happy Hour on LinkedIn Live. Super excited for our conversation today. A little backstory. I heard Jules talking on a clubhouse room several weeks ago, and he just said some of the coolest things. And I was like, I knew I needed to talk to him about higher ed. And so I'm glad we were able to finally work it out. So Jules is the Chief Academic Officer at Mix. Jules, thank you so much for being here. Can you just start by telling us who you are and what you're up to?
Hi, I'm Jules Coleman. I'm the Chief Academic Officer at Mix. And as Robert has pointed out, I spent the vast majority of my previous life in higher education, beginning as a professor in the philosophy department at Berkeley. I taught at other universities at Wisconsin, Arizona. I spent most of my career at Yale University in the law school and the philosophy department, and had other appointments on and off in political science and elsewhere. And later in my academic career, I became a senior advisor to the president and provost of New York University and helped formulate the plans for New York University moving into Abu Dhabi and Shanghai. And at a certain point, my wife gave me permission to join the president of NYU, who had been a longstanding friend of mine, as a senior administrator, and I became the senior vice provost at NYU, in charge of academic planning for the entire network university. Though I had been a philosopher and a law professor for most of my academic career, I had always had an interest in education and in its transformative possibilities. I myself was a first generation college goer in my family, and was, on the one hand, extremely proud of the achievements I was able to reach, but also felt extraordinarily fortunate for the opportunities that were presented to me. And I spent a lot of my time thinking about the difference between the distribution of talent in the world and the distribution of opportunity, and the role that education plays in bridging the gap between the two, and the problem in providing access to opportunity to the vast majority of individuals globally. And I've spent most of my life since leaving. I left when the president left at NYU and wanted to pursue another stage in my life while I still had the energy and the wherewithal to do it, to see what I could do to make education more accessible to more people.
That's awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us. Just as a caveat, obviously everyone's kind of still working at home. And so I live in downtown LA. So if you hear sirens or other such things, just please forgive that. But I think it's important to start out. We had a brief conversation before this, but it's important to clarify the terms. So what do you think is the difference between higher education and college? We often talk about them synonymously. But is there a difference, and why is that distinction important?
Well, great. Thanks for the question, Robert. I actually think it's an important difference requires a little bit of reconceptualization. Colleges and universities are ways in which higher education is currently delivered. It's not the equivalent of higher education. I think it's sometimes more helpful to think of higher education as referring to a distinctive period in a person's life between the ages, say, of 18 and 23, 24, 25, something along those lines, in which one is taking the general educational forms and content and skills that they developed over a period of time through, say, the age of 18, through public education and so on, and getting themselves ready for taking their place in society as a whole. And what is involved in taking one's place in society as a whole changes depending on the nature of the society. But it means having the capacities, the skills, the knowledge, the wherewithal, the confidence to become a member of a particular community, social, political, and economic, finding your place in the economy, being prepared to take care of yourself and take care of others, learning what your responsibilities are to other people, how you can execute on those responsibilities, what you can do to make the world a better place, what things in the world just happen to you, what things you own, what the difference is between those, learning how to understand them, learning how to integrate them into your life. These are things that we all need and things we improve on as we make our way through adulthood. And everybody needs the skills, needs the content in order to be able to make that transformation, in order to be able to take the education that they've had up until that point and turn it into a capacity to make your way in the world, to find meaningful work, to find purpose in your life, and to take on responsibility and accountability for what happens, including what happens to you over the course of your life. And that education is something everybody needs. There's no one who can get by as well as they might without it. And colleges and universities have done an extraordinarily good job over hundreds of years providing that and other things to an ever smaller relative proportion of the population. And so if we continue to focus on colleges and universities as equivalent to what higher education is, and if we adopt as well the fact that college education has been disappointing for some people and reaches fewer, with the response that, well, that just proves college isn't for everybody, we're going to lose a golden opportunity to fully develop the human capital that's out there in the world, that's currently now being underserved or not served at all. And so part of changing policy is reconceptualizing the distinction between higher education on the one hand, which is something virtually everybody needs, and college and university life, which is something that benefits fewer, but does quite good for many of those it does.
Something we hear a lot is higher ed, college is broken. Do you think that college is broken?
No, I think it's hard to think that something that's as durable as colleges and universities are broken. They're in pain, but they're not broken. And so it's more interesting to, and some, of course, don't feel the pain at all, and others feel the pain quite acutely. And some of the problems are episodic, and some of the problems are more chronic. So I think it's helpful if we distinguish between and among those. And if you don't mind, I'd like to do so by introducing some other concepts which I know are of interest to you and you'd like to see us discuss.
Totally.
So the first one then is the distinction, the idea that I've long thought about and written about, and other people have as well, which is the unbundling of education. And the one I'd like to talk about after that, if it's all right with you, is the monopoly signaling power that universities have had that is eroding.
Yeah,
Right?
totally. Yep.
All of those contribute in some way to the story, the narrative that college is broken. And they provide some evidence for there being existing issues and problems and challenges that need to be addressed. But I think they need to be addressed cooperatively, and I'll get to that as we move along. But let
Yeah.
me start out with the idea of education as a bundled good, if you don't mind.
Yep.
Something
Yep. Totally.
we've talked about before. A bundled good is a good that is comprised or composed of a variety of other goods. So many of you or your parents have gone on vacations and they've purchased vacation packages. This is a simple example of a bundled good, because on a typical vacation package, you get the airlines, you get the hotel, you get picked up at your home, you get 2 free rounds of golf, you get to gamble for free. Well, you never get to gamble for free, but if it's to Las Vegas, you get your room for free. But the hotel, you get the hotel for free, but you lose that and more at the gambling tables. But in any case, the basic idea is that you are getting a number of different goods all packed into one. Now, there are two kinds, broadly speaking, of bundled goods. Ones that are transparent to the underlying goods, both to the price of those goods and to the value of the purchaser of those goods, and non-transparent bundled goods. So a vacation package is a good example of a transparent bundled good. Retail shopping is a decent example of an unbundled good, of a bundled good that is partially transparent to its component parts, which Amazon completely exploited by turning the retail shopping business on its head, on the assumption that what people were prepared to pay for was the purchasing, the search, the purchasing, and the return. Lots of other aspects of the good, like learning more about your neighborhood, getting physical exercise, seeing people, running into people, both haphazardly and intentionally.
Yep.
Amazon's bet was, hey, those people can find those goods elsewhere. They don't need those only through shopping. The thing that they're willing to pay for in shopping is the search, the purchase, the return, and maybe a couple of other things. And they completely upended the retail business. Now, education is it's a bundled but not transparent good. So most people, when they purchase an education, are purchasing a number of things. I'll mention them in a second. But the value to the consumer of all the component parts and the cost to the provider of the component parts are not known. Or if they are known, they're not revealed or priced in a marketplace.
Right.
So think of it this way. If you think about higher education, what do? You get a lot of knowledge, content. You get a degree or a certification. That's a kind of accreditation.
Yep.
You get to spend time away from home, which is very valuable.
You network.
You get to try out your autonomy and your agency and learn what it's like to be responsible as an individual and secure certain achievements, and also incur certain liabilities as a result of what you do. For example, if you do drugs on campus. And you get to meet friends for life, find future employment, and basically what your parents get is you're out of the house. Now, and there's more to it, but the question is, what's the value of all of it?
Right.
Right? It's captured in a number, which constitutes your tuition and room and board, or something along those lines. However, when Coursera first tried to unbundle this package, their insight was that what people would be willing to pay for is the content. That the content, the rest of it is less valuable, or people can achieve it in some other way. But what Coursera found out at the beginning was that they can get 45 million or 50 million people on the platform taking courses, as long as they don't have to pay much for it, and as long as they can leave without repercussions at any time.
Hmm.
So actually, the real value of the content, this is an exaggeration, approach zero. So what was the value? What was the value proposition in college? And the answer to that was, first, the accreditation, the signal, the completion of a degree,
The credential, I see.
the credential, establishing that you were employment ready or that you were ready to go on to an advanced degree somewhere else. And that, when Coursera recognized that, and other people recognized that, there became a range of partnerships with Coursera and universities to produce a variety of online degrees using the content to create accreditation. But what we learned during the pandemic was something else altogether. Notice that one of the interesting outcomes of the pandemic, nothing's positive about the pandemic, though there have been a couple of collateral benefits,
Sure.
at least with regard to knowledge, is that we learned that people really wanted the experience. They missed the peer-to-peer. They missed the in-place aspects, the opportunities. They were living at home in their family's basements. I'm exaggerating. Well, if they wanted to live in someone's basement, it was going to be the friends they were hanging out with at college.
Right.
Right? They didn't want to live in their parents' basement. And so there were a number of lawsuits when universities continued to charge their full tuition. There were lawsuits demanding that some money be refunded because much of the college experience had been lost.
Yep.
Accreditation had not been lost, the content had not been lost, but the college experience had been lost. So there is an experiential dimension that was not being adequately priced into the colleges. And so
Right.
that opened up marketplaces to offer experiential learning, experiential peer-to-peer collaboration, the online content, while getting you job ready and education ready, right?
Wow.
And
Yeah.
that, the question is, okay, that's a different bundling of the goods, especially if you're transparent about it.
Hmm.
But the question was, from a political economy point of view, would those efforts succeed or not? Now, if universities had maintained their de facto monopoly of signaling employment readiness, it would have been much more difficult for these alternative forms of education to succeed. But in fact, that monopoly has been eroding steadily over time
Hmm.
for two different kinds of reasons. One is the value proposition from the point of view of the student, let's call student, parent, customer, or consumer.
Right.
More and more information has come out about the job readiness of students, the dollars that they make over a period of time after graduating college or university, and contrasted with the total cost and the scope of the debt that students have incurred. That's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is employers. While university employment offices report that their students are job ready, employers reject this idea, which is shown up in their behavior. Namely, most employers report that it takes 12 to 18 months of additional training in order to prepare the student for a job that they applied for. which is often a beginning level job. And so the consumer on one end, the employer on the other end, have given us grounds and provided some erosion in the signaling power of universities and the capacity of universities and colleges to acquire talent and also to price their product without regard to the underlying value of the various component parts.
Wow. Yeah, and you had mentioned something earlier, and I don't know if this is kind of the connection, but the idea of learning models versus teaching models in higher ed,
Yes.
and how that plays a role.
Yeah. Do you mind if I actually discuss two things?
Sure, go for it.
So the first thing I wanted to discuss, because I left it out of the previous discussion, was the universities. I don't think they're broken. I just think these are problems that they've had advantages with regard to signaling, that those advantages are being removed or their strength is being weakened. And they have to be responsive to this going forward. And there are lots of ways of being responsive. But one advantage that they maintain that really is unfortunate, I don't think the other advantages are unfortunate, they're just facts. This advantage is an unfortunate one, and that is with regard to financial aid. The vast majority of people who are seeking financial aid from the government, which is in the form of secured loans, which is just at the end of the day a way of betting on yourself. If you take this loan, you're betting on yourself. So everybody who takes a loan is betting on themselves to a certain degree.
Yep.
And the government is willing to subsidize through the interest rate reduction, you're betting on yourself. But they'll only do it for people who are enrolled in degree granting institutions, by and large.
Right.
Now, that's power that is misplaced and is unfortunate, in part for a reason I really would like to get to for a minute. And that is, we all recognize that the distribution of talent is much more even than the distribution of opportunity. That's a starting point for virtually all of us. And most people think, and rightly so, that as this continues, and if it continues, it is a kind of unfairness because it creates ever increasing inequalities in outcomes for individuals, inequalities in opportunities and inequalities in outcomes. People don't have the same relative opportunity to improve the quality of their lives or the lives of their children if they can't develop their talents or have no access or opportunity to do so. But I think from another perspective, a purely global wealth perspective, a purely making good use of our resources perspective, this is a horrible misuse and unpreparedness to efficiently develop human capital. There is a lot of human capital overall that's going to waste. And when we all say on the one hand that our children are our greatest resource, that people is the world's greatest resource, and not to develop it for the advantage of, broadly speaking, the world overall, the globe overall, or just selfishly for the United States overall, is as foolish with regard to our survival and our overall well-being as our denial of climate change. It's as stupid and foolish. And so I think we need to rethink financial aid at the government level, not because it's a Democrat or a Republican thing. It's an American thing. It's just the desire to allow people to bet on themselves and pursue alternative forms of education as they do so. Those were the two things that I wanted to bring up. And I'll get back to the learning versus teaching anytime you like.
Yeah, sure. And something interesting I read this week that I had no idea about, but the idea that tuition costs, the cost of higher education, the cost of college, sorry, is doubling every 8 years. And so it's like way past inflation. And we're just, you play that out, 16 years from now, and we're going to be in the six figures for a college undergrad education, which to me seems absurd. I wanted to, we've got a couple of questions, so I just wanted to quickly show these. Are you able to see these on the screen here? Reggie had asked, do you think there was ever true alignment and that the alignment is being eroded, or has there never been alignment and it's now being uncovered? And he's talking about between job readiness being signaled by universities versus what employers are saying.
Well, I think, the one way I would like to think about it, there are lots of ways to think about it. The one way of thinking about it, has it ever been intentionally aligned when it's been aligned? Or has it just been haphazardly aligned? That is, of course, I'd like to think that as a person who taught in college for 40 plus years, I'd like to think there's been some alignment and that things have changed. And I think people probably always have felt that way and probably will feel that way going forward. But I think now we're seeing such a dramatic change. So I'm sorry, let me start with another idea first. Colleges themselves are unavoidably filled with a lot of structures and obstacles to rapid change. And some of this makes an enormous amount of sense because, as is very clear, there are always intellectual fads of one sort or another. There are always things that seem like great ideas to pursue intellectually, or important areas in which we should secure knowledge and pass it on to others. And colleges put up barriers to doing that too quickly. So they're not testing grounds for ideas. They're normally, after ideas have, they're not great testing grounds for ideas.
Right.
At some, for some ideas, they are. But typically, they are resistant to change. And so even where there are alignments, when misalignments can result from the slowness in the existing structures that are obstacles to quick responsiveness to changing environments. And part of that is a good thing. But of course, it's also a negative when things are changing very rapidly and the changes are systematic over a wide range of activities. It's like the Defense Department always fighting the last war. It's very hard for academic institutions to be visionary about where things will go, where jobs will be. And of course, since the way people get positions in the universities for teaching, this normally involves years and years of commitment of a certain very disciplined kind of training, which by the time it arises, things have changed again. So there are some careers in which the training continues to be aligned. This is typically with regard to professional schools, right? Which is a very small subset of people who go through education or full higher education. So I think the key point is that the structure of institutions are naturally somewhat conservative. They are not quickly responsive to change. So there is always the risk of there being some forms of misalignment going forward. That's inevitable. The real problem now is, given the mechanisms by which people gain access to university positions, where they are among the faculty teaching the relevant content and skills, in a world that's changing so rapidly, we have a systemic mismatch that is no one's fault. But it's very hard for universities to move quickly. And that would bring me to a discussion, if you don't mind, about the difference between learning and teaching.
Yep. That's where I was headed next.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you. Because all of these things, in my mind anyway, are connected.
Sure.
So there are a lot of ways into this. So we can start with an honest realization that post the reforms of the Industrial Revolution and the illegality of sending 8-year-olds to work in mines and elsewhere, that's the negative side of it. But honest, and the idea that we were going to have a different society post-industrial revolution, and more people were going to have to take their place in society and not just in a workforce going forward, it became apparent that there was a need for certain forms of large-scale education. Right? Even as there was large-scale education, it was not well offered equally to everybody. So keep that in mind, because that's always been the case. Always been the case.
Yep.
But the buildings that were built to house large numbers of students, all being educated at a certain time, according to a schedule, because the fundamental issue was the efficiency of educating people up to a certain point in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And during this period of its development, it was also the beginning of the age of education being a front-loaded activity in people's lives. Education all occurred between an age of, say, 3 or 4 or 5 to 21, 18, then to 22, then to 27 or so if you got a graduate degree and so on.
Yep.
But it had a beginning and it had an end. That's all that counted. And the beginning and the end took place relatively in the first part of a person's life. And that was fine, along with it being large scale. That is, big classes, big groups, all at one time, all learning the same thing. 5-year-olds went with other 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds went with others. Very, very regimented, very disciplined, because it was a large numbers game, number one.
Yep.
And it had to take place at a certain point before people then got married, had families, had jobs in families, which were basically economic units, secondarily social units,
Yep.
and moral units. They were secondarily moral units. The churches were primarily moral units, but they were primarily economic units. And then you were dead at 50. Right? The world has changed. The world has changed. But that world was also designed around a certain view of education as consisting in a form of teaching. That there were certain people who had the job or the love of gaining access to information that not everybody could have. Not everybody had the skill to do so. Not everybody had the opportunity to do so. Not everybody had the desire to do so. The people who did went to college. A subset of those who went to college became teachers. Teachers were those individuals who had a particular responsibility within the world, which was to convey the information that they had. And then there was a difference between those who conveyed it well and those who conveyed it poorly. And there were measurements or ways of assessing whether people did it well or did it poorly, and whether the recipients got it or didn't. Right? And if you just looked at the architecture of a school or a schoolroom, you saw this philosophy of education as teaching reflected in it. There's a blackboard. There's now whiteboard. That was a big improvement. Or a screen with sheets, right, that you put on it and projected it. But it was the same idea. There was information out there that somebody had access to, was displaying it to other people. That person was standing in front of the information, conveying it to a group of students, sitting in rows and columns, all facing the teacher, who were on occasion invited to ask questions and answer and respond. It was hierarchical, directional, and the art was the art of teaching.
Hmm. I never thought of it that way. That's crazy.
Yes. Well, so I think about things like this way
Yeah.
all the time. So,
Yeah.
interesting thing about teaching is it's also this view of education is completely reflected in our institutions of education through their architecture. They're
Right.
built for teaching.
Totally.
Very few of them are built for learning. And it's not as if we don't know more about learning than we once did, right?
Right.
So if you stop for a second and you ask yourself just a few questions, here are a couple of fun ones. What reason do we have for thinking that the 55-hour class produces optimal learning results? The answer is zero. We have no
Hmm.
evidence at all that learning is best done in 55-minute segments, followed
Yeah.
by a 5-minute walk to another class. There's literally no evidence on that.
Right.
We also have, for young kids, no evidence whatsoever that when you're in kindergarten, you should go a half day for optimal learning. But once you get to the first grade through high school, you need a good eight hours, right? Now, high school is a little different because people can take care of themselves, most of the kids, when they get home. But
Right.
let's just imagine through junior high school, your basic 8 hours. What is the empirical evidence that learning outcomes are optimized over an 8 hour day, 5 days a week? To which the answer is we have no such evidence.
Right.
That was designed for entirely different kinds of reasons: scheduling, care of children so parents can work. No, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. What I'm saying is it has nothing to do with learning outcomes. It
Right.
also has nothing to do with behavior outcomes. And
Wow.
behavior outcomes have a lot more to do with learning outcomes than anything else.
Hmm.
So, this transformation from a teacher based model to a learning based model is not even currently reflected in the architectures of universities and colleges. Yet we know that various forms of experiential learning are much stickier. And we know a lot more about the way people learn in general. So even the enormous investments that colleges have made in their buildings is something that's reflected in the prices, but is not connected in any meaningful way with learning outcomes. So employers report it's not as well connected or correlated with employment readiness than we think. Learning theorists tell us it's not primarily reflected in interesting ways with learning outcomes or
Hmm.
in early education with behavioral outcomes. So we are in a world in which we're learning a lot more. We're restricted by the architecture, the buildings, the approaches we've adopted, the strategies that universities have quite rightly adopted to fend off faddish movements and so on and not make foolish investments. And what we all need is to increase the portfolio of available ways of moving forward.
Yeah. It
With
reminds me of something that Ben Horowitz said in his book. I've been reading his book. The idea of we should be teaching far more statistics than calculus. The idea is that like the world that you live in is all about statistics and probabilities, not if you do A and you do B, C will be the outcome because much of the world doesn't act like that. And so I think that to your point, it's like how can those models teaching and learning be done in a way that allows people to experiment and explore probabilities and statistics instead of I'm going to teach you the math, the proper way to do it, and that's the way it's always going to be because the world just isn't like that.
Well, I think, there are fascinating ways of conveying material, and Good teachers have always been able to do it, in a variety of fascinating ways. But being out in the world is one of the ways of doing so in the hands of an extraordinary person. So I like to think of educational design, which is not at the center. I mean, I was in charge of academic planning, mind you, at NYU for several years. And it was during this period that I got to think about, I mean, that's within a very confined situation, which so much of the planning has already been done, and there's 100+ years of history of it. And
Right.
you don't go in there and say, I'm sorry, you're doing it the wrong way. That's foolish. And in fact, I didn't know that people were doing it the wrong way. I just had no sense about whether people were doing it in the wrong way. But one of the things I've come to see is what we really are doing as academic planners and education designers is a form of ecology. We're creating environments for learning. And we have to feed those environments with nutrients, air, oxygen, opportunity, comfort, a sense of confidence in our students. We have to shine a light. We have to water it every once in a while. We have to prune the garden every once in a while, too. Some ideas just aren't as good as other ideas are. And someone's got to have an ability to curate and still
Yeah.
make judgments. It's not as if it's something that's completely non-judgmental. It needs to be. It needs to be normative. It's got to be value-driven. But we are ecologists at the end of the day. We're not architects in this regard. We're not building structures. We're building environments for people to learn. And that's an enormous, let's call it a certain kind of paradigm shift that
Totally.
needs to be integrated as we move along. Because
Yeah.
most successful change involves a sustainable adaptability. It doesn't involve a radical revolution. It must be an adaptation that's sustainable over time. And that
Yeah.
has to be built up. We all have to play a significant role in doing that, if we
That's
can.
great. Yeah. So I've got two more quick questions that I wanted to ask, and then we'll wrap things up. One is something around the idea of colleges consolidating. We have 4,000, some around 4,000 universities in the U.S. And you had mentioned something a couple of days ago that all of them are just kind of replicating what the others are doing. There's no real like collaboration, consolidation, or if we're going to think about the business world, mergers and acquisitions. If a college gets acquired, it's mostly about their real estate or maybe some IP. So, what do you think consolidation looks like going forward in light of the fact that education is becoming unbundled? Universities are a bit slow to adapt and change. Um, but it does seem like there's maybe too many, or because of waning interest in universities, they can't all survive. So what do you think that looks like? The idea of consolidation.
Well, so let me backtrack a little bit
Yeah.
before I give the answer, because it's kind of interesting to how we got here.
Right.
How we get here. So if I were to ask you 25 or 30 years ago, what are the largest segments of the economy, or large segments of the economy, that are don't experience a lot of merger and acquisition or consolidation? I think
Mm.
you would label four if you thought about it a lot. I'm only saying that because I thought about it a lot, and I
I
labeled
have
four,
not thought about it a lot. Okay.
right? So the first one is healthcare.
Right.
25, 30 years ago. Healthcare, a lot of hospitals, separate hospitals, a lot of doctors' offices, separate doctors' offices, some joint practices, but not a lot.
Hmm.
Um, Education, unbelievably fragmented. Philanthropy,
Mm.
how much philanthropy, of course, depends on what kind of tax code you have. But where there's a favorable tax code, there's a fair amount of philanthropy. The United States has the most, by far. But no one is seeing the merger of the Bill Gates with Warren Buffett philanthropy. They may work together on various projects under their own names.
Right.
They don't join forces otherwise. And local governments. Local governments continue to be a very interesting case, right? Because I right now I'm in my house in Hamden, Connecticut, outside of New Haven, and if you walk 5 blocks one direction, you'll find North Haven. If you went, a half a mile in the other direction, you'd find West Haven or something like Fair Haven or some Haven,
Yeah.
and then Bethany and whatever. And all of us within, 5 miles of each other, 10 miles of each other, each of us with our own administration, our own fire department, own police, own school system, own everything, right? No thought ever given to coordinating, consolidating, and whatever, right? Philanthropy is no thought. Healthcare changed. Healthcare changed because now you see hospitals buying up every private practice they possibly can.
Yep.
And once they are organized, they then distribute health plan. So you can get health plan from the New York University Hospital at 35, 40, 50, 100 places in New York City. You don't have to go in to First Avenue and 30th Street anymore. Same Yale New Haven. You can go throughout the whole state of Connecticut and get Yale New Haven treatment, right? Not so education. Why not? Why not? Education is the second largest economic sector in the world. In the world. And yet, it's the most fragmented. And I think it's a good question to ask why. How'd that happen? How did it all grow up? Well, in state universities, it's easy to tell the story about how that grew up. Every state legislator who lived in a certain community had, after the prison was already allocated and the state capitol was already allocated and the main university was already allocated to a city, there was a question about what about a smaller branch of this university located. So when I taught at the University of Wisconsin, the question was, well, what about Whitewater? What about La Crosse? What about Eau Claire? What about Green Bay? So all of a sudden, there was the University of Wisconsin had 2 major campuses in Madison and Milwaukee, and about 15 other campuses in every city that had over 8 people. That's a slight exaggeration. Let's say 8,000 people would probably be close to the truth. So state universities just expanded that way. That was legislature dealing, right? So then it's a different way of getting state money into local places. When the money comes into the local places, then you can build businesses around the university, right? So they're important to the overall life of the university. But as a university themselves, they're in trouble. They're in trouble.
Yeah.
They're fighting for resources where the power brokers are Madison and Milwaukee. I'm just using that as an example.
Sure.
For private universities, they grew up around churches of one sort or another, many of them,
Yep.
and then, or religious sects of one sort or another, and they grew up to educate the elite of a certain area. But the problem is, going forward, they all duplicate the back office, the administration. They all have presidents, provosts, vice provosts, heads of alumni, whatever.
Right.
They all have an enormous back office to reach everybody that they reach, to do the finances that they do. They're all teaching the same courses, and they're all paying for buildings that they are going to have difficulty filling. Now, one reason, so we're more likely to see failures than acquisitions.
Right.
In big cities, schools like in New York City, I'm close to because of my friend, the former president of NYU, John Sexton, who began his career teaching at St. Francis College in Brooklyn. they are, like many colleges, financially in enormously bad shape, but they have good real estate,
Mm,
right?
interesting.
So, so they may fall and be replaced by housing. Others may be bought for, instead of study abroad, study away. So someone may buy, who would like to have a presence in New York City, buy a St. Francis so that they can have their students do a semester of, say, Notre Dame in New York because it's such a large alumni group. So we'll see a little of both, right?
That's
And we'll
fascinating.
but there's no real knowing what will happen. And I think if I were in an education, I explored one point with a very close friend of mine the possibility of heading up a family education foundation, one that had about $200 million. And when I talked about it, I said, the only thing I would be willing to support are programs within various colleges that changed the structure of those colleges together,
Hmm.
that change them together. And of course, that everybody is unwilling to do that. But when the universities and colleges are no longer able to offer, to price non-transparently, and the constitutive goods of the bundled good get priced accordingly and valued accordingly, all hell will break loose.
Yeah.
All hell
I
will break.
was it almost seems like there's a bit of a, if we were to able to zoom out a bit and think about time not in like 10, 20, 30 years but in hundreds of years, it almost seems like there's a bit of a bubble happening because in the research that I've been doing from the 1600s till 1862, the primary institutions in the US were religious institutions training pastors, teachers, etc. And then in 1862, we passed the Moral Act, which allowed for, they basically said each state gets 30,000 acres of land. You can sell it and start your own colleges, which started the big kind of universities that you know of in a lot of these states, a lot of the A&Ms, for instance, because they wanted to teach.
The big land
Yeah,
grant.
exactly. Train workers to work in industrial type positions, which going back to your point about teaching models. And from there, we just expanded till the internet kind of comes to fruition, I don't know, or early mid 90s. And from then it's just been, skyrocketing. And now it feels like we're up at this, you use the term paradigm shift. It seems like a pivotal moment in terms of colleges and universities, their role in society, which is fascinating. And until I was able to find that context of where we've been and where we're at right now, I wouldn't have known that. And so I guess the final question I would have for you is, if you were in charge of a university, a lot of the people who might tune into this are deans, they're provosts, chancellors, people who have the ability to make some changes, maybe not sweeping changes, but iterative changes. What if you were in their position? Like, what would you be doing now in their roles with your with your understanding of the past and your vision of the future? What are some of the things that they can be doing now to address that shift?
Oh, well, that's an excellent question. And if I had a really, really if I was really confident about my answers, I would be a very wealthy consultant at this point, or
True,
about to
true
become
that.
a wealthy consultant. But what I would say is this: you can see the thing that everybody is doing, and I don't disagree with the ambition to do it. They're trying to increase their flexibility. And the way they're trying to increase their flexibility is by reducing the extent of tenure track appointments at universities, because that the large part of the operating cost of university is always going to be faculty, right? So what they're doing is, but that's, I don't view that as a solution, because that's not a plan. That's just a way of being more flexible about the resources that you have. So
Right.
I think you got to say to yourself, what do we do well, and what do we need to do that we don't do well, and who can we partner with? That is, so one of the things we don't do well at standard universities is we don't experiment well, right? We experiment small and everyone is hoping that the experiment fails, especially when it comes to different modalities of teaching. And everybody sets up an office for teaching improvement and teaching excellence and funds it and then walks away from it, right? And hopes it
Yeah.
does something, hopes it does something.
Yep.
And people who would otherwise do great research but don't teach very well, they send them over there to make sure they can still get tenure by improving their student evaluations. Uh, but but so, what do you do well? What don't you do well? Experiential learning. Universities don't do experiential learning very well. They're not set up for it. The people they hire typically are not people who do it. But there are people elsewhere in other programs who do that quite well. Partner with them. You have a study abroad program. You just fill out your study abroad program with students so that you can backfill your dormitories, right? You send 30% of your students overseas every semester. Therefore, you can take in 25% more students than you actually have beds for. Okay? Make sure that 30% that are going overseas to educate are getting a good education. And also, a third of them every semester are going. How about doing things abroad or outside that you don't do well on your campus, right? Augment, supplement with the things you don't do well, which are largely focusing on learning, focusing on projects, focusing on experience, and so on. Try to augment your offerings with the opportunities that you have available to you and take responsibility and accountability. Realize, now, the one thing we didn't discuss, I know we're drawing to an end, but I desperately want to do this. When we talk
Sure.
about college, we are in a death cycle of a certain sort about financial aid, not just about who gets it. We talked about that. But if you go to most universities now, you keep wondering, why is the price of education going up? Continually going up at such a high rate. If I told you the leading factor in that, or one of the leading factors in that, I think personally it's probably the leading factor, but I can't guarantee it, you would be shocked. And the answer is financial aid. Now, that's the solution isn't to have less financial aid. How does that work? Well, financial aid is so desperately needed so that, and I don't have a big endowment, so I can't pay for financial aid the way Princeton and Yale can out of my endowment. So I have to pay it out of the revenue of the students who come to my school. That means every dollar I get in revenue is really only 70 cents. So I'm taking 30 cents out of every dollar in order to pay for the students to be there. Well, therefore, my revenue just got reduced by every year. It continues to get reduced somewhat because I can't make it up for on my endowment side. So I have to add more students. But I add more students, more of whom need financial aid, thereby actually increasing. Right now, I have to hire more faculty. I have to hire more faculty because I have more students. So whatever it is,
30% goes to 35%.
all right, and so the numbers really, one of the drivers, even if everything else say relatively constant, the fact that we have funded and paid for higher education in the United States in the way in which we have, that we have not invested in taking the resources and the talent that we have among the people in the United States and developing it and exploiting it in the positive sense of exploiting it to everyone's advantage and to the life prospects of the individuals who have that talent. And it focused instead on a very small percentage, actually, is the crime for which we are paying now.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. And I think with that, we'll just leave it there because that's powerful. I like that, and I have so many more questions, but we've run out of time.
Well,
So, Jules,
I'm
I just want
always available. I'm not going anywhere.
Awesome. Well, maybe we'll do a part two sometime soon.
Love to participate in everything
Awesome.
you're doing. I know that you're doing a great job in consulting with and helping institutions of higher learning, and any way I can be helpful to you in thinking through that and exploring that with you. I think we're better when we're all working together.
Totally. 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 And kind of the core belief that we have at Unincorporated is that education is the primary means of ascension in society. Obviously, how the education is delivered, we can deliberate on that. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. Super excited to talk again. Everyone, thank you for tuning in. If you have more questions, drop them in the chat and we'll try to figure out how to get them answered maybe next time. But yeah, you can check us out on Instagram, check us out on Twitter, and certainly follow us on LinkedIn so that you can be tuned into the next time we do this. So with that, we'll end it here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.